So hello and good afternoon from Vienna to all of those who are joining us today via Zoom and via YouTube. My name is Noah Mayhew. I'm a research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nonproliferation. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the third installment of the VCDNP's Deterrence and Emerging Technology, or DET, webinar series. The DET series is a collection of 6 webinars that we have planned for each Wednesday at the same time of day at 3 p.m. Vienna time, which will run through November 3rd of this year. We founded the DET series to explore the impact of emerging and disruptive technologies on the stability of deterrence, as well as on the opportunities that these technologies could offer for arms control and the creation and implementation of confidence-building measures. Today, we're going to discuss the impact of artificial intelligence on capabilities related to situational awareness, command, and control. On one hand, artificial intelligence is increasingly considered for helping to deal with the complexity of signals that have to be tracked for different purposes and the compressed decision times that inevitably come with an ever-changing deterrence environment. On the other hand, artificial intelligence tools may be vulnerable to external influence, such as sabotage or manipulation of incoming signals. Questions are being raised as to what constitutes sufficient human intervention in decision-making, and threats to the control of nuclear weapons is a particularly frightening question when it comes to the AI realm. Meanwhile, with all of this in the background, international cooperation with respect to artificial intelligence remains, in a word, challenging. Our speakers, whom I will introduce in a moment, have a tall order today to help us understand these risks and how we might mitigate them. However, as they're both very highly respected experts in this field, I have no doubt they are up to the task. But before I introduce them, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First, please note that this webinar, but not the question and answer portion, is being recorded. You'll find a summary of today's discussions, as well as a recording of the presentations given, available on our website a few days following the event, and that website is www.vcdnp.org. Second, we will also be tweeting about the event today, so do feel free to follow us on Twitter at, our handle is @VCDNP. During the question and answer portion, those of you joining us via Zoom are welcome to submit questions using the Q&A function, which you may access at the bottom of your screens. Please do not submit questions using the chat function. And for those of you joining us via our YouTube live stream, please submit questions via email to events@vcdnp.org. That is events@vcdnp.org. So without further ado, I'm pleased to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We will start with Dr. Ingvild Bode, who is an associate professor at the Center for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. She's the principal investigator of the European Research Council-funded project called AUTONORMS, Weaponized Artificial Intelligence, Norms, and Order. The AUTONORMS project investigates how practices related to autonomous weapon systems change international norms, especially those governing the use of force. AUTONORMS investigates military, transnational, political, and dual-use practices in China, Japan, Russia, and the United States of America. Generally speaking, Ingvild's research focuses on analyzing processes of policy and normative changes in the area of peace and security, especially in relation to weaponized artificial intelligence, the use of force, and United Nations peacekeeping. Her research has been published by journals such as the European Journal of International Relations, the Review of International Studies, Contemporary Security Policy, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, as well as a range of other outlets. Her most recent book, entitled Autonomous Weapons and International Norms, which was co-authored with Hendrik Huls, will be published by McGill-Queen's University Press early next year. After Dr. Bode's remarks, we will turn to Dr. James Johnson, who is a senior lecturer in strategic studies at the University of Aberdeen. He's also an honorary fellow with the University of Leicester, a non-resident associate on the ERC funded Towards a Third Nuclear Age project, and a mid-career cadre with the Center for Strategic and International Studies project on nuclear issues. Previously, Dr. Johnson was an assistant professor at Dublin City University, a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point, and a postdoctoral research fellow at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. He's the author of Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Warfare, USA, China, and Strategic Stability. His latest book project with Oxford University Press is entitled Artificial Intelligence and the Bomb: Nuclear Strategy and Risk in the Digital Age. So without further ado, I'm happy to pass the floor to Ingvild for her remarks. Ingvild, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much, Noah. Let me just share my screen. Right, there we go. So thank you for inviting me to present at the United Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and thank you for this kind of introduction, Noah. So it gives me great pleasure to share with you some of the reflections of my ongoing research and weapon systems or weaponized AI. So you already heard a bit about the project that I'm leading, and there's some more info here in terms of our website and our Twitter handle if this is something that is of interest to you. I will start with some slides that kind of speak more, kind of set the scene in a way for what I'm going to talk about later on in my presentation. So as you see here, I deal in particular with the issue of weaponized AI rather than much broader military applications of AI. And often when we talk about weaponized AI, we hear the term autonomous weapon systems, which are systems that once activated can track, identify, and attack targets with violent force without further human intervention. So these ORs are quite often used as a catch-all term, but they're actually not a clearly definable category of weapons. But rather, it's more useful, I think, to talk about AI-driven features in targeting functions, or to talk about autonomous or automated functions that weapon systems have. So AI, autonomy, and automation have been defined in multiple ways in this debate, and it can be quite difficult sometimes to wrap your head around what these terms mean and how they are distinct to each other, especially as also assessing kind of to what extent systems that we hear about in the media are autonomous or are automated is difficult to assess because basically actors who are involved in the debate have various of these terms. And also the process of defining what is AI, what is automation, and what is autonomy is deeply political. So that means actors have a political stake in defining the extent to which such systems are autonomous or not. So I'll give you here, just to set the scene, a couple of brief definitions that I'm using in my research. So for me, autonomy means that a system is capable of, once activated, performing some tasks or functions on its own. And the kind of the core tasks that are animating my research are really these critical targeting functions. And then it's also, I think, useful to think about different ranges of actions that these autonomous systems are capable of performing. So quite often you have kind of the current level of autonomy in weapon systems can be a choice between pre-programmed ranges of action, and then you have systems in development that use machine learning to identify different actions and choose between them. So I think in this context, then it's quite useful to think about autonomy or automation along a spectrum, which is this little table here, where you basically have on the left-hand side remote control systems such as drones, where humans remain in manual control of targeting functions. And on the right-hand side, you would have fully autonomous weapon systems where humans are no longer involved in those decisions. And in the middle, and this is kind of the phase or the kind of phase of the spectrum that's most interesting, actually you have a mix of automated autonomous features, and you have instances of complex human-machine interaction. So interaction between the machine and the human. If you might, I mean, of course, we hear a lot about weaponized AI at the moment. And you might ask yourself the question, is weaponizing AI really new? And the short answer to this is no, it's not new. I think basically militaries around the world have been doing research on integrating autonomy automation into weapon systems for decades, right? And some of these things would maybe have been called AI then and would not be called AI now, right? But there's always this kind of evolving notion of what it means actually to say that something is operating with artificial intelligence. And these are just a number of systems that use autonomous features and targeting that are already used by states around the world, such as air defense systems, guided missiles, active protection systems, counter-drone systems, or loitering munitions. And some of these systems actually have quite sophisticated autonomous functions. So I just use one example here that is maybe quite well known, the Aegis combat system, so a shipborne air defense system that has been used by the US Navy since the 1980s. It has quite advanced autonomous settings in the sense that the system is capable of automatically targeting threats that meet its parameters without human intervention. The map on the right-hand side shows you the proliferation of some of these systems. So these are states operating some type of air defense systems, often more than one, and that is around kind of 90 states worldwide. And what I think is interesting when we think about the existence of these systems already out there is that quite often in the debate about weaponized AI, these systems are not really addressed. And rather the problem of weaponized AI is kind of pushed towards the future as a kind of emerging technology, as a potential future weapons. And this is really something that I think we should stop doing. I also want to bring us briefly to the question of stupid AI, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron, right? So you have artificial intelligence that actually is not very smart and not very intelligent. If you think about what kind of animates the research in AI, it's really this attempt to make computers do the kinds of things that humans or animals do, but quite often actually find systems that are not very smart or not very intelligent. And the research, this is also called stupid weapons, so weapons that are likely to fail, that are brittle, and that have no common sense. And quite often, if you look at the literature of what is kind of identified as the most pressing issue in terms of weaponized AI, are these kind of stupid systems. So I have here a quote from the 100 report that kind of brought together social sciences and the technical sciences and talking about the potential effects of AI. And they come to one of the conclusions that the main concern is not kind of these kind of superior intelligent systems like humanoid killer robots, but incompetent machines of inferior intelligence. And I think in light of this, it's quite important to consider that we will always kind of see in the now and also in the near future humans and AI systems operating in collaboration with each other, right? So it's not entirely useful to think about AI on its own, but it always has to be thought of in connection to a human. And this is really then the transition to the topic of situational awareness. That is the topic of today's webinar. So situational awareness is basically a mode of human cognition that involves the accurate perception of the surrounding environment. So in a military sense, this means perceiving the presence of the enemy, anticipating the threat they pose, and responding in kind. One of the most famous kind of definitions of situational awareness is provided by Ansley, who talks about the perception of elements in the environment, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of the status in the near future. And so this kind of quest for situational awareness is one of the main reasons why states are using military applications of AI. Because the idea is that they are able to increase situational awareness through using AI in different kinds of ways. And this kind of sees the main advantage. So in a way, this is kind of a capability objective of increasing situational awareness and lifting the fog of war. So a concept that has kind of inspired military thinking since the 19th century, referencing, of course, Karl von Clausewitz. So AI is basically supposed to make the battle space more legible. It is supposed to facilitate the identification of enemies and thereby increase operational control. So this is kind of the ambition that AI is supposed to fulfill in a military sense. I want to unpack this critically in the next couple of slides by first of all saying that these kinds of visions or ambitions follow essentially an instrumental perspective on AI. So they see AI as a tool that humans can use to make better decisions, rather than recognizing that AI may also fundamentally change human agency and human-machine interaction. So I think we see here in this kind of in the way that militaries talk about AI, a lot of evidence of a certain technological solutionism. So its solutions for current problems will be found once the technology, in this case AI, advances. So whatever the problem is now, it is not a problem in the future because a technological solution will become available. And I think we should also be aware of the fact that AI is quite a speculative field of tech development. And there's something, if you read some of the discourse of militaries on this, I think there's almost something like a dreamlike quality, this idea of overcoming human error by using AI and by kind of transitioning from kind of human weaknesses to something that is superior. But in a way, this is kind of done in the context of a tech development that does not follow a clear line of progress, but actually that is actually highly speculative in nature. And I want to talk about in particular in the next couple of slides on what other researchers also have called the algorithmic fog of war. So that rather than kind of lifting the fog of war once and for all, the kind of promised ambition of AI, we actually see that in using AI in a weaponized or military way, it creates a new fog of war, an algorithmic fog of war that might even be denser than the original fog of war. And I will unpack this further in the next couple of slides. So this first slide kind of looks at some of my past research on lessons learned from existing weapon systems. So as I said, these are not necessarily entirely new problems, right? Because we've already seen autonomous features have targeting in air defense systems. And this is part of a research I did earlier this year, and also kind of works a lot with human factor analysis by John Hawley. This research really looks at how, through integrating AI into air defense systems, how this has changed the role of the human operators of these systems. And the major role change has been from them being active controllers to actually becoming passive supervisors. And this role change involved not only, of course, delegating motor or sensory tasks to machines, but also cognitive tasks. And if we look at what this meant for human operators, often this meant a loss of situational awareness. So let me unpack this a bit further. As passive supervisors, humans typically find themselves either in situations of underload or of overload, and this has an adverse effect on their situational awareness. For the long hours of monitoring the system, human operators are basically underloaded with tasks as the system is more or less doing its work. And when the system is used to potentially released force, they can find themselves suddenly overloaded with tasks to perform. For example, to critically triangulate objects and that the system identifies as targets or put forwards as targets and deliberate whether to use force or not. And the fact that these situations of overload typically happen in high pressure combat situations makes the task of regaining situational awareness difficult. Because of course, these one of the main advantages of AI on the one hand is this introduction of a higher speed of operational decision making, but this also creates problems for the human decision makers. In this case, we have to decide in a matter of seconds whether to authorize a release of force or not. And we've seen actually looking at some of the cases in the past that this has led to costly mistakes involving air defense systems, such as the downing of civilian airplanes, or also instances of friendly fire. So the most recent example actually happened just last year in January 2020, when a Russian manufactured Tor M1 system operated by Iran mistakenly fired 2 missiles on the Ukraine Airlines flight PS752, killing all passengers and crew on board. So I think we should also consider how introducing AI doesn't just alleviate certain tasks, but also creates new kinds of complexities for the human operator to understand the system. And quite often we find that human operators actually lack a functional understanding of how AI is actually engaging in targeting decisions. So rather than presenting a ready-made solution for lifting the fog of war and increasing situational awareness, AI-driven technologies also introduce novel problems into decision-making on the use of force that I will unpack even further in the next 2 slides. So one of these big fog of war is so-called data bias. I'm sure that you've heard about this already. What is, I think, in terms of popular applications of AI, what is quite interesting about this is that in the military discourse, AI still is predominantly portrayed as being more accurate and more precise than humans. And this kind of constantly assumes almost the data used to program targeting algorithms is clean or is neutral. But we see from popular applications of AI that the story kind of turns out rather differently, because they tend to replicate the bias inherent in the data used for their programming. So some of the examples that have been quite popular in the literature has been, of course, the facial recognition systems, performing best in identifying white males, but have difficulties in correctly identifying people of color or women. You also have examples of hiring algorithms following gender-biased processes, of credit score algorithms making decisions based on social or ethnic stigma. And the opacity of machine learning algorithms often makes it very hard to critically assess whether such biases exist and where they originate and how they can be solved, if that is possible. So such biases already sustain injustices in the civilian sphere, but I think they're even more problematic if we apply them to a military context, because here decisions tend to be irreversible. So if we think about decision of life and death, you can't change the outcome of that decision once you saw a bias was in place. Another issue are kind of particular vulnerabilities weaponized AI may be subject to, or actually is subject to, such as literature talks about adversarial attacks on neural networks that are the basis of machine learning. And such adversarial attacks can take physical or digital forms. So in the digital form, and this is kind of the picture on the left, these are alterations to images that are imperceptible to the human eye. So by adding so-called noise to the pixels of an image, adversarial attacks can provoke images to be misclassified or misdetected. So the picture here on the left shows that in the left-hand column, the pictures are correctly identified. For example, the bottom one is dog. And by adding this digital noise, they are misclassified then as ostrich. Physical adversarial attacks kind of work along a similar logic, but also the physical space within the vision field that forms the sensor input of a computer vision system. So in other words, perturbations are physically added to the objects. And this image kind of shows you another example that gained a lot of popularity, where 3D printed adversarial objects were generated that could fool neural network classifiers. So in this case, the 3D printed turtle was consistently identified as a right turtle by the image recognition system. So this means that adversarial attacks on the integrity of machine learning models that form the basis of targeting algorithms could be conducted in subtle and hardly detectable ways before they're even used in practice, as well as on the battlefield itself. Let me conclude. Whoops, that was a bit too fast. Okay, so the purpose of my presentation really was to try to contrast this military vision of AI enhancing situational awareness, something completely positive quite often, and contrasting this with the so-called algorithmic fog of war. And we should understand this algorithmic fog of war not only as AI introducing new vulnerabilities, such as bias or the potential for adversarial attacks, but also in how military applications of AI fundamentally change and circumscribe human agency over the use of force, like the study of air defense systems has shown. States often actually point to the inevitability of integrating more and more AI into weapon systems or military applications. In this narrative, weaponizing AI or military applications of AI becomes part of a steady, overwhelming process that policymakers can't change. I think this is not good enough. The quest for technical solutions hides the fact that there are political decisions being made in the process. And let me just illustrate this with a final example. One of the reasons for integrating AI into weapon systems is the operational need for faster action and reaction. In other words, the need for speed, exceeding human capacities. But while speed is a tactical advantage, there are also strong strategic reasons for slowing down the speed of warfare. As Jürgen Altmann and Frank Sauer in an article argue, when we consider the strategic stability comes under threat with weaponizing AI, retaining human slowness to decelerate events in big wars may be a good thing. So and I think we should consider more of these kinds of questions, because at the moment there's no specific international law or regulation to govern weaponized AI or military applications of AI, leaving basically applications of military AI considerable freedom of maneuver. And the problems I have highlighted suggest that it is high time to draw clear boundaries on what is and should be inadmissible in weaponizing AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingvild, for that fascinating and somewhat terrifying presentation as to what's possible. So now I will be pleased to hand the floor to Dr. James Johnson for his remarks, and then we will open up the floor to Q&A. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you there, Noah. And I'd like to extend my thanks to Alina and the team at VCDNP for their generous invitation, also the introduction. I'm delighted again for this opportunity to engage with the program in Vienna, and also to engage with former colleagues at CNS Monterey as well. And a big thanks also to Mara and Noah for facilitating this event. Okay, so in this short presentation, I will aim to cover the following areas. I'll begin with a brief outline, introducing some of the risks of AI being introduced into the nuclear enterprise. Then I'll consider some arguments for and against automating decisions at a strategic level to machines. Then I'll explain how AI might increase the risk of accidental or inadvertent nuclear use. And finally, I'll highlight some of the trade-offs and potential deterrent paradigm shifts and outline some possible risk reduction measures. So my latest book unpacks the following research themes that consider how and why AI-fused capabilities might cause or exacerbate escalation risk, complicate deterrence, and impact crisis stability dynamics in a future conflict between nuclear armed rivals. Connecting these research threads, and perhaps most relevant for this talk, are three features of the digital age that I argue will complicate nuclear stability, including information overload and complexity, dis and misinformation, and greater automation of NC3, that's nuclear command control communication systems. Today I'll focus on two research threads, that is the automation of the strategic decisions to machines and the risk of accidental inadvertent nuclear use. So how might delegating decisions to machines affect stability and deterrence? Now, during crisis conditions, the deterrent effect of AI, I argue, like other capabilities, is predicated on the perceived risks associated with a particular capability it enables or enhances. The higher the uncertainty generated by a particular capacity, thus in deploying AI augmented capabilities into a crisis, could encourage an actor to act more cautiously, thereby potentially increasing its utility as a deterrent capability. So counterintuitively, perhaps, states may view further automation of nuclear command and control as a way to manage escalation risk and actually bolster deterrence. That is signaling to an adversary that any attack or even the threat of one might trigger a nuclear response. So in other words, a prima facie argument, albeit loose one, exists that building automated response mechanisms into NC3 systems could resolve the logical paradox which is inherent with rational-based classical deterrence, that is premised on mutual assured destruction or MAD and the will to retaliate, therefore ensuring mutual vulnerability and perhaps improving stability. However, because of the difficulty in demonstrating this kind of a posture before a crisis or conflict, this kind of implicit threat, which is akin, I guess, to Dr. Strangelove's doomsday machine on steroids, may equally worsen crisis stability. In short, while AI-enhanced capabilities certainly offer militaries major offensive and defensive, operational, tactical, and strategic advantages, being unable to demonstrate this capacity to others, especially in asymmetric situations, will very unlikely promote stability and peace and probably have the opposite result. So a key factor is, I argue, the degree to which a particular technology, in this case AI, will disproportionately affect states' perception of the current balance of power. Besides the confusion and uncertainty that would inevitably result from mixing various levels of potentially unknown levels of human to machine interaction and AIs reacting to events in non-human ways at machine speed could and will arguably likely increase inadvertent risk. This risk is compounded further by overconfidence in and a reliance on AI decision support tools, known in psychology, as we've discussed in the previous presentation, as automation bias, meaning that false negatives and false positives could very easily go unnoticed or even ignored. As an example, the recent defeat by a human F-16 fighter pilot by AI in a Dartford-sponsored Alpha Dogfight Challenge clearly demonstrated how AI is performing in these complex, dynamic, albeit virtual environments for now, can compress decision-making and use very unorthodox or non-human tactics in a high-stakes game of human-to-machine chicken. This chart depicts AI applications that are either being tested, developed, and in many cases already deployed within the broader nuclear deterrence architecture, including early warning systems, intelligence, surveillance and recon, command and control, and also various non-nuclear deterrence operations like cyber warfare, missile deterrence, and counter cyberspace. So how might mixing various levels of human to machine interaction affect deterrence? We saw in some recent wargaming hosted by Rancor in the US, they explored the effects of mixing various degrees of human to machine collaboration on crisis dynamics. And they revealed some, albeit preliminary findings that are quite interesting. The games found, all things being equal, when high levels of autonomy were combined with human decision-making, or in the latest jargon, humans in the loop, escalation risk is likely lower. This hypothesis was attributed to the fact that human involvement in decisions allow for more time to de-escalate a situation, and for now at least, humans are thought to be better at understanding signaling compared to an AI. In a separate and certainly more futuristic and speculative scenario, when high levels of autonomy was combined with decisions made by machines or humans out of the loop, not surprisingly, escalation risk is deemed to be high. Conceptually speaking, for now, an AI algorithm that is optimized to pursue certain pre-programmed tactical goals could very easily misinterpret an adversary's signaling a desire for a resolution to avoid or de-escalate a situation, thus complicating the very delicate balance between an actor's willingness to escalate a situation as a very last resort and keeping the option open to step back from the nuclear brink. To be sure, a lot of these issues remain theoretical for now, and a lot of open questions remain about how various components of this hypothetical synergy would actually work in practice. And obviously the data sets are very limited at this stage. For example, would commanders on the ground become too reliant on an AI, believing it to be superior doing its own job? Or perhaps juxtaposed, might commanders equally distrust AI's recommendations because of its machine fuzzy logic? Or could an adversary calculate different risks due to the presence of non-human agents on the opposing side? So how might AI tools in the hands of third-party nefarious actors drag nuclear adversaries into conflict? In the digital era, the catalyzing chain of action-reaction dynamics set in motion by third-party actors, criminals, terrorists, for example, taking two or potentially more nuclear-armed rivals to the brink is fast becoming a plausible scenario. To be sure, the historical record is replete with examples of nuclear false alarms, accidents, and other risks associated with increasingly complex, porous, interconnected, and automated NC3 systems, which despite their alleged closed nature, offers motivated actors with multiple and increasing pathways for manipulation and exploitation. In the digital age, decision makers are exposed to greater volumes of information coming from, for example, satellite imagery, 3D models, and geospatial data, which during a crisis can create lots of novel pathways to manipulate and propagate campaigns of mis and disinformation. In theory, non-state actors could, for example, target nuclear command and control systems, early warning satellites and radars with AI-enhanced cyber weapons without the need for physical or kinetic attacks, to have Tom Schelling's so-called power to hurt. While for now, thankfully, such an attack is beyond the abilities of, albeit the most sophisticated actors, emerging technology like AI and cyber weapons and cyber tools will likely lower the threshold, creating new pathways to accomplish nefarious goals through the manipulation and distortion of the information landscape where crucial strategic decisions take place. For example, spreading disinformation, conspiracy theories, false memes, and fake news on social media. Now, during a crisis involving, for example, two nuclear powers, thinking perhaps US and China, or Pakistan and India, when communication systems are compromised, nuclear weapons are on high alert, decision-making timeframes are already compressed, especially if launch authority is already pre-delegated or on high alert status. The consequences of information operations could be catastrophic. A good case in point was the 2019 Indian-Pakistan crisis. This combined a very toxic mixture of cross-border terrorist attacks, disputed territory, offensive nuclear postures, and escalatory rhetoric playing out on social media, including implicit nuclear threats. And this makes it very easy to imagine how actions of a third-party actor might spark an accidental nuclear war. This kind of dynamic is compounded by the human tendency to make fast, reflective, and shortcuts or heuristic judgments, or so-called system one thinking, when an abundance of information or information overload exists alongside unfamiliar technology, read AI, which can mean manipulated and false information is accepted as fact or truth, even if it can be easily debunked. In sum, AI-powered technology is rapidly becoming another capability in the toolkit of third-party actors to wage campaigns of disinformation and deception, which both sides in a competitive dyad can have used against them. So briefly to outline some of the trade-offs in this employment of AI and autonomy in the nuclear enterprise. This entails a multitude of trade-offs that hopefully should persuade policymakers to pursue and pause to consider whether these new AI-powered capabilities might strengthen or complicate stability and deterrence in a very fragile, multipolar nuclear world order. Examples of these trade-offs include maintaining adequate control and supervision of AIs to mitigate escalation risk, while exploiting benefits of increased lethality, scale, and speed that is afforded by AIs. Assimilating AI into false posture and doctrine, while mitigating the dangers posed by increased speed and reduced levels of control and oversight, especially of nuclear weapons. And designing algorithms that support command and control systems with sufficient knowledge of the laws of engagement, without, however, degrading the capacity to predict and respond to threats. Put simply, governments today face a very challenging environment with contradictions, dilemmas, and trade-offs about whether and how to integrate AIs into the nuclear domain, which must be examined in the broader context for deterrence, stability, and non-proliferation goals. So this last slide, just to think about what can be done to mitigate these risks. Lines of effort, I argue, can be broadly categorized into 3 or 4 areas, including enhancing the safety of nuclear weapons and hardening nuclear systems and processes. For example, safeguards and risk assessments to strengthen nuclear systems against cyber attacks. Also improving command and control protocols and mechanisms, like adding redundancies and enhancing launch protocols. Thirdly, designing more robust safeguards to contain the consequences of errors and accidents when they inevitably occur. And perhaps more importantly, at this stage in the short term, modifying existing arms control and verification approaches, innovating new norms and behavior in the use of AI systems, and encouraging bilateral and multilateral building measures or confidence building measures and stability dialogue on emerging technology more broadly. And we can discuss some of the details of these measures more broadly in the Q&A session. So in closing, given the rapid pace of developments in this technology, now is a time for kind of positive intervention discussions such as today's forum before it's too late. That is to preempt the possible and very likely destabilizing effects of AI and help it to steer it towards enhancing stability as the maturity of the technology develops. As Alan Turing astutely noted back in 1950, we can only see a short distance ahead, but there is still plenty that needs to be done.